Power means nothing when the world stops seeing you.
Langston Hale built an empire out of code and ambition. A man who climbed from nothing to the 42nd floor of Chicago's skyline. But tonight, every screen turns red. Every system dies, and the billionaire who once ruled everything is about to learn that salvation doesn't always come from the top. Sometimes, it starts in the shadows. Welcome to Golden Heart Stories. This is the story of a man who built an empire out of code and ambition. And the woman the world never noticed. Who stepped out of the shadows to save everything he thought he controlled. The glass walls of Wacker Tower glowed against Chicago's November skyline, like a monument to ambition. On the 40th floor, Langston Hale stood alone in his corner office. His reflection sharp against the darkened city beyond. At 42 years old, he had built Northlake Dynamics from a startup in his garage into a technology empire worth billions. Tonight, everything he had constructed would either solidify into permanence or crumble into memory. The Meridian contract, a $900 million partnership with the federal government, sat waiting for final approval, and every muscle in his body coiled with anticipation. He had worked 18-hour days for 6 months straight to secure this deal, sacrificing sleep and sanity to prove that a black CEO could command respect in an industry still dominated by inherited privilege and old money networks. His fingers drummed against the mahogany desk, a rhythm born from nerves disguised as confidence. The office smelled of leather and fresh coffee, the scent of late nights and relentless pursuit. Outside his door, the skeleton crew worked through scattered cubicles, their screens casting pale blue light across tired faces. Langston had sent most staff home hours ago, keeping only essential personnel for the final security checks before tomorrow's announcement. He loosened his tie slightly, feeling the weight of expectation pressing against his chest like a physical force. The silk felt expensive against his throat, a reminder of how far he had climbed from the South Side neighborhood, where his mother had cleaned offices just like this one. The clock on his wall ticked toward 9 o'clock each second, a small hammer against silence. Langston refreshed his email for the 100th time, waiting for the confirmation that would change everything. His jaw tightened. Success had become oxygen he could not imagine breathing without it anymore. The faces of investors, board members, and competitors flickered through his mind. Like ghosts demanding tribute, he had promised them triumph. He had promised himself legacy. His reflection in the window stared back at him, with eyes that had forgotten how to rest, shoulders that had forgotten how to relax. Then, at precisely 9 o'clock, the lights flickered. A brief stutter, like the building's heartbeat skipping. Langston's head snapped up, his brow furrowing. The overhead fluorescents dimmed once, twice, then stabilized. Probably just a power surge, he thought, though unease crept beneath his skin like cold water. He glanced at his monitor and froze. The screen had turned completely red, glowing like a wound. White text scrolled rapidly across the crimson background, lines of code he did not recognize but instinctively feared. His breath caught in his chest. Within seconds, every monitor across the 40th floor erupted in synchronized chaos. Red screens blazed from every desk, every conference room, every display panel mounted along the walls. The emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in harsh white brilliance that made the red glow seem even more ominous. Alarms shrieked through the corridors, sharp, mechanical screams that spoke of violation. Langston's pulse hammered against his throat as he rushed to his keyboard, fingers flying across keys that no longer responded. The system was locked, frozen, dead. Sweat beaded along his temples despite the cool air conditioning. He tried his backup terminal, his tablet. His phone. Every interface met him with the same crimson screen and cascading code. Years of innovation, terabytes of proprietary research, client data worth billions in intellectual property, all of it vanishing before his eyes like sand through desperate fingers. The elegant empire he had constructed with precision and pride was being reduced to digital silence, and he stood powerless, watching his legacy dissolve into the red glow of catastrophe. His hands shook as he grabbed the edge of his desk, knuckles whitening. Langston's breathing grew shallow. The office that had felt like a throne room moments ago now felt like a tomb. The alarms continued their merciless wailing, but beneath them, he heard only the roar of his own blood. The collapse of everything he had believed about control and power. He looked around at the empty office, at the red screens reflecting off glass walls, like dying suns, and understood with brutal clarity that all his authority meant absolutely nothing when the world stopped seeing him, when the systems that proved his worth simply ceased to exist. He was alone in a tower of his own making, watching it burn in digital flames. For the first time in 20 years, Langston Hale felt invisible. The alarms continued their relentless shrieking, piercing through the walls like accusations. Langston stood frozen at his desk, his mind racing through impossible calculations, trying to determine how many minutes remained before total collapse became irreversible. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, and his hands hovered uselessly over the dead keyboard. The red glow from the monitors painted his face in shades of failure. Then he heard footsteps. Not the confident stride of an executive, but the steady rhythm of someone who belonged in spaces others overlooked. Langston's head turned sharply. A woman appeared, pushing a cleaning cart with practiced efficiency. She wore the dark blue uniform of building maintenance, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked to be 36 years old, with brown eyes that took in the chaos with unexpected focus rather than fear. Ruth Marlowe stopped just inside the threshold. Her gaze swept across the room, absorbing the red screens, the flashing emergency lights, the scattered papers Langston had knocked aside. She noticed him standing there, this tall man in an expensive suit looking utterly lost in his own kingdom. She stepped forward slowly, as though approaching a wounded animal that might lash out. Her eyes narrowed as she studied the nearest monitor, the cascading code reflecting in her irises. Langston watched her lips move silently, reading the patterns. Then she spoke, her voice low and certain. "That's not a system crash," she said, still staring at the screen. "It's an attack." Langston's first instinct was to scoff. The sound escaped his throat before he could stop it, a harsh laugh born from stress and wounded pride. Who was this janitor to diagnose what his entire IT department could not? His lips curled slightly, defensive anger rising in his chest. He opened his mouth to dismiss her, to restore some small measure of control over a situation spiraling beyond his grasp. But then Ruth stepped closer to his terminal, her fingers hovering over the keyboard with confidence. She tilted her head, studying the code patterns with surgical precision, and began speaking in technical language that stopped Langston's breath. She pointed to specific lines of malicious script, explaining the attack vector, the payload encryption, the vulnerability in the authentication protocol. She pinpointed the exact entry point within seconds, her finger tapping the screen where the corruption had begun its spread through the network. Langston felt his scoff die completely. His mouth closed. His breathing slowed. The defensive armor he had raised crumbled under the weight of undeniable competence. He stared at her not with skepticism now, but with the dawning realization that this woman, this person he had never truly seen, despite walking past her countless times in these very halls, might be the only thing standing between him and absolute ruin. His expression shifted from contempt to something raw and desperate, his eyes searching her face for confirmation that she was real, that this impossible moment was actually happening. The sweat on his palms felt cold suddenly, his throat tight with emotions he could not name. For the first time that night, Langston Hale looked at Ruth Marlowe not as staff, not as invisible labor, not as part of the building's fixtures, but as someone who might actually save him. His voice, when it finally emerged, had lost all its earlier arrogance. It sounded small and human and afraid, stripped of every layer of executive polish he had spent decades constructing. "Can you stop it?" he asked. Ruth's eyes met his, steady and unflinching, and in that gaze he saw the answer before she spoke. Maybe, if he was willing to trust her. If he was willing to let go of everything he thought he knew about who mattered and who did not. The red light from the monitors continued to pulse around them, painting the moment in shades of crisis and possibility. Outside the windows, Chicago's skyline glittered with oblivious beauty. Thousands of lives continuing while his entire world balanced on the edge of a precipice. The moment stretched between them like a bridge being built in real time. Constructed from necessity and the strange alchemy of crisis turning strangers into allies. Ruth's hand still hovered near the keyboard, waiting for permission to enter his system, to access the heart of everything he had built. The alarms continued screaming, but somehow the sound had become background noise. Less important than the silence growing between two people who had never spoken before tonight but who now held each other's fates in their hands. Langston's hand trembled as he reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers closing around the master access card that represented absolute authority over every system in Northlake Dynamics. The small rectangle of plastic had always felt like a symbol of power. Now it felt like a surrender. Ruth stood beside him, her expression calm but expectant, waiting for him to make the decision that his pride screamed against but his desperation demanded. He hesitated, his jaw working silently as years of self-reliance warred with brutal reality. Finally, with a breath that felt like defeat, he extended the card toward her. "Everything you need is on this," he said, the words tasting like ash. It was desperation disguised as courage. Ruth took the card without ceremony, her fingers brushing his briefly before she turned toward the door. She moved with purpose now, no longer the invisible maintenance worker but someone with a mission. Langston followed half a step behind, feeling strangely diminished in her wake. They walked through the devastated office floor, past cubicles where red screens glowed like funeral pyres, past conference rooms where presentations for tomorrow's triumph still sat frozen on dead displays. The emergency lighting cast everything in stark shadows, transforming the familiar landscape of his empire into something alien and threatening. His expensive shoes clicked against the tile with each step, a hollow sound that echoed his hollowed confidence. The elevator ride down felt eternal. Neither spoke. Langston watched the numbers descend 39, 38, 37 each floor, taking him further from the world he controlled. Ruth stood perfectly still, the MasterCard held loosely in one hand. The fluorescent light above them flickered occasionally, casting brief darkness that made Langston's chest tighten. He was descending into his own building and yet felt like a stranger. The basement door opened with a pneumatic hiss, releasing air that smelled of concrete and machine oil. They stepped into a corridor lit by industrial bulbs, the walls painted institutional gray, pipes running along the ceiling like mechanical veins. The temperature dropped noticeably, and Langston felt goosebumps rise along his arms despite his suit jacket. Ruth led him to the server room entrance, swiped the MasterCard, and the heavy door unlocked with a metallic clunk that resonated through the silence. She pulled it open, and they entered the company's true heart. The server room stretched before them like a cathedral of technology. Rows of black towers hummed with continuous life, their indicator lights blinking in patterns that suggested consciousness. The air conditioning roared overhead. The sound was immense, a mechanical symphony that swallowed all other noise. The hum of machines replaced dialogue, became the only conversation that mattered. Langston stood at the threshold, suddenly aware that he had never visited this room before. Shame colored his amazement. Ruth moved between the server racks with practiced familiarity, her eyes scanning identification labels until she found the terminal she needed. She pulled a rolling chair from against the wall and sat down, her fingers already flying across the keyboard before Langston could process her speed. The monitor before her filled with cascading lines of code, diagnostic reports, error logs that scrolled past faster than he could read. She worked with surgical precision, tracing corrupted files through the system's architecture. Following digital breadcrumbs through folders and databases that represented years of accumulated work. Her face remained composed, but Langston could see the intensity in her eyes, the way her jaw set when she discovered another corrupted sector. He stood behind her, useless and observing, watching the company's heart flatline on the screen. Graphs showed data loss in real time, percentages climbing toward total system failure. Recovery attempts failed one after another, each unsuccessful reboot another nail in the coffin of everything he had built. The numbers were merciless, clinical in their documentation of catastrophe. Langston felt his throat constrict, his hands clenching into fists at his sides as he witnessed the slow death of his legacy. Rendered in progress bars and error messages. But then, after what felt like hours compressed into minutes, Ruth's fingers paused. Her head tilted slightly, and she leaned closer to the screen. A faint flicker appeared in one corner of the monitor, a backup node that the attack had somehow missed, overlooked in the chaos of corruption. Hope reborn through human connection, through one person's refusal to surrender to digital destruction. 6 hours dissolved into a blur of keystrokes and system commands, time marked only by the shifting darkness visible through the small basement window. Ruth worked with relentless focus, her fingers never slowing, her eyes tracking code patterns that Langston could only pretend to understand. He had stopped asking questions around hour 3, when it became clear his presence served no technical purpose. Instead, he watched her work, this woman whose name he had never known until tonight. The server towers hummed their mechanical chorus around them, indifferent witnesses to the slow resurrection happening at Ruth's fingertips. The untouched backup node became their salvation. Ruth coaxed it back to life with careful precision, treating the corrupted system like a patient bleeding out. She isolated infected sectors, quarantined malicious code, and began rebuilding the network's core functions from clean data. Progress came in agonizing increments: 5% restored, then 8, then 12. Each percentage point felt like a small miracle. Langston stood behind her chair, his back aching from hours of standing, his eyes burning from exhaustion, but he could not look away. Around 4 in the morning, something shifted. The primary server bank, dark and silent for hours, flickered with new life. Green indicator lights began replacing red ones across the racks, a constellation of hope spreading through the mechanical darkness. Ruth's shoulders sagged slightly, the first sign of physical strain she had allowed herself to show. She typed a final sequence of commands, hit enter, and leaned back in the chair, her hands falling to her lap as though the strings had been cut. The monitors displayed system recovery statistics in neat columns: 63% of critical data restored, 71% of core functions operational. Not perfect, but functional. Not dead, but breathing. Langston felt something break inside his chest. The emotion came without warning, rising from somewhere deep and unguarded. His eyes filled with tears that he could not stop, did not try to stop. They ran down his face silently, carving warm tracks through the exhaustion coating his skin. He was 42 years old, a man who commanded boardrooms and negotiated with government officials, and he stood in a basement weeping. The man who had commanded thousands now depended entirely on one woman's hands. The humility was devastating and somehow cleansing. Ruth turned in her chair and looked up at him. Her expression held no judgment, no triumph, just a quiet understanding that seemed to see through every wall he had ever constructed. She did not speak immediately, perhaps sensing that he needed this moment to feel the full weight of what had almost been lost and what had been saved. The silence between them felt sacred somehow, a shared acknowledgement of the night's brutal lessons. Finally, Langston found his voice. It came out rough, scraped raw by emotion and exhaustion. "You fixed the system," he said, the words inadequate for what he actually felt but the only ones he could manage. Ruth held his gaze for a long moment, her brown eyes reflecting the green glow of the restored servers. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but carried the weight of truth that could not be softened or avoided. "Then fix what broke before the system did." The line pierced deeper than any data loss ever could. It went past the screens and the code, past the networks and the hardware, straight into the heart of what had actually failed tonight. Not the technology, but the man who had built walls so high around his success that he could no longer see the people holding it up. The janitor he had never noticed. The systems he had never visited. The foundation he had taken for granted because it worked invisibly, asking nothing, noticed by no one. Redemption begins, Langston understood, not with restoration, but with recognition, seeing clearly what had always been there, hidden only by his willful blindness. He nodded slowly, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Ruth turned back to the monitors, already beginning the next phase of recovery, her work continuing even after she had delivered the truth he needed most. Langston remained standing behind her, watching the green lights multiply across the server. Racks like stars emerging after a storm, and felt something he had not experienced in years. Not just relief or gratitude, but genuine humility, the recognition that he had been saved not by his own brilliance, but by someone he had never thought to value until crisis forced him to see. Dawn broke over Chicago with reluctant light, pale and cold as it filtered through the conference room windows on the 40th floor. Langston stood at the head of the table, his suit rumpled from the sleepless night. His tie loosened in a way that would have been unthinkable 24 hours earlier. The emergency meeting had been called at 7 in the morning. Executives summoned from their homes with terse messages that offered no explanation beyond urgency. They filed in now, faces tight with concern and barely concealed anxiety. Taking their seats around the polished table with careful movements of people bracing for catastrophe. The room smelled of fresh coffee that no one touched, the silence heavy with unspoken questions and mounting dread. Ruth stood near the door, still wearing her maintenance uniform, her posture uncertain in a space clearly not designed for someone like her. Langston had asked her to attend, insisted actually. Though he could see the discomfort in how she held herself slightly apart from the executives settling into their leather chairs. She belonged to the basement and the night shift, to spaces these people never saw, and her presence here violated some invisible boundary that everyone felt but no one had explicitly drawn. Her hands fidgeted briefly with her uniform sleeve before she forced them to stillness. A small gesture of vulnerability that made Langston's chest tighten with protective instinct. The chief technology officer, Gregory Ashford, arrived last. He was a man in his early 50s with silver threading through his dark hair and the confident bearing that came from decades of being the smartest person in technical conversations. His expensive suit fit perfectly, everything about him suggesting control. He nodded to colleagues as he took his seat, his eyes barely glancing at Ruth before dismissing her presence entirely. The contempt was subtle but unmistakable, hidden behind professional courtesy like a blade wrapped in silk. Langston cleared his throat, drawing all attention to himself. His voice carried something raw and honest that made several executives lean forward. He explained the attack in technical terms he had learned from Ruth, describing the breach, the corruption. The near-total loss of everything Northlake Dynamics had built. Faces around the table grew pale, hands gripping armrests as the magnitude settled over them. Then Langston turned toward Ruth, extending his hand in her direction. "This is Ruth Marlowe," he said, his voice strengthening. "She's the person who saved this company last night. While our systems were dying, while I was helpless, she traced the attack, isolated the breach, and rebuilt our core infrastructure. Without her expertise, we would have lost everything." The announcement hung in the air like something fragile and dangerous. Ruth's face flushed slightly, her eyes widening at being addressed so directly. Around the table, executives exchanged glances: skepticism, confusion, discomfort at having their hierarchies disrupted. Gregory Ashford's expression remained carefully neutral. But Langston noticed how his jaw tightened, the brief flicker of something dark passing behind his eyes. The contempt he had hidden behind his tie now leaked through in the slight curl of his upper lip. Langston continued, his voice gaining momentum. "Effective immediately, I'm appointing Ruth as interim head of cybersecurity for Northlake Dynamics. She has demonstrated more expertise in one night than we've seen in years. She will report directly to me and have full authority over our security infrastructure." The words landed like stones in still water. Some executives nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom of acknowledging genuine competence. Others looked uncertain, their loyalty to established order warring with undeniable evidence. But Gregory's reaction was different. His hands curled slightly into fists before he relaxed them. His smile remained fixed, but his eyes had gone cold and calculating. He offered congratulations that sounded sincere to anyone not watching carefully, but Langston saw the truth beneath. It was jealousy dressed as magnanimity, pride wounded and already planning its recovery. The symbolic act of trust had been completed, witnessed by everyone who mattered. But as the meeting adjourned and executives filed out, Langston felt a presence lingering, a brewing storm of jealousy and wounded pride that would not simply dissipate. The audience had sensed it too, that electric tension between Gregory's polite surface and the fury burning underneath. Recognition had been given, but acceptance was another matter entirely. 3 weeks passed in a blur of system audits and security protocols. Ruth settling into her new role with the same quiet competence she had shown that first desperate night. Her office was small, tucked into a corner of the 40th floor that had previously housed storage equipment. But it had a window and a door that locked luxuries she had never imagined in her years pushing a cleaning cart through these same hallways. She arrived early each morning and stayed late, rebuilding firewalls and implementing authentication layers that should have existed from the beginning. The work was meticulous and consuming, and she threw herself into it. With the dedication of someone who understood that trust once given could be revoked just as quickly. It was during a routine midnight audit that Ruth first noticed the anomaly. She had been reviewing access logs, cross-referencing user activity against expected patterns, when something caught her attention. Like a discordant note in familiar music. Strange midnight logins from internal accounts, occurring at intervals too regular to be coincidental but irregular enough to avoid automated detection systems. Her fingers paused over the keyboard, her breath catching as she traced the digital footprints through server pathways. These weren't external attacks or random breaches, these were authorized credentials being used during hours when those employees should have been home sleeping. Someone inside the company was moving through their systems like a ghost, accessing databases that had nothing to do with their official duties. Ruth's stomach tightened with familiar dread as she compiled the evidence, timestamps and file transfers documented with forensic precision. She stayed at her desk until dawn broke over the city, her eyes burning from screen glare. Her coffee growing cold in its cup as she pursued patterns through logs that stretched back months before the original attack. The data told a story of systematic betrayal, someone who had been preparing for a long time, who understood the systems well enough to move almost invisibly. Almost, but not quite. Everyone left traces if you knew where to look, and Ruth had learned during her years of invisibility to see what others overlooked. The anonymous texts began arriving 2 days later. The first one came while she was riding the elevator down to the parking garage, her phone buzzing with a message from an unknown number that made her blood run cold. "Stop digging if you know what's good for you." The words were simple, almost banal in their directness, but the implication was clear enough to make her hands shake as she gripped the phone. Someone knew what she had found. Someone was watching her work, monitoring her movements, waiting for the moment when discovery became too dangerous to ignore. Fear crept into Ruth's chest like ice water, settling there with uncomfortable weight. She had spent most of her life being invisible, moving through spaces without being noticed, and there had been a kind of safety in that anonymity. But visibility came with consequences she had not fully calculated. Now she had an office with her name on the door, a title that marked her as important, and enemies who saw her as a threat worth eliminating. She deleted the text message but could not delete the fear it had planted. More messages followed over the next week, brief, threatening, always from different numbers that disappeared when she tried to trace them. Each one felt like a tightening noose, confirmation that her investigation had struck something vital and angry. Then came the GPS tracker. Ruth discovered it on a Friday evening as she walked to her car through the mostly empty parking garage, her footsteps echoing off concrete walls. Something made her pause, some instinct honed by years of noticing details. She crouched beside her vehicle, running her hand along the undercarriage until her fingers brushed against something. Wrong, a small black device attached with magnetic force. Her heart hammered as she pried it loose. Someone was watching her, following her movements. The violation felt physical. Ruth stood in the parking garage with the tracker in her hand, the weight trivial but the implications crushing. The mystery tightened around her like closing walls, and she understood with brutal clarity that her circle of trust had narrowed to a single person. Everyone else in the company was suspect now. But Langston, the man who had given her this chance, who had looked at her that first night with desperation and recognition, he was the only anchor she had left. She needed to tell him what she had found before the invisible threat became something more tangible and dangerous. Ruth spent 2 days building the digital honeypot, constructing it with meticulous care. The decoy database looked legitimate from every angle, filled with what appeared to be proprietary research files, information valuable enough to draw interest, but fake enough that its theft would cause no real damage. She designed it as bait, a trap disguised as treasure, and then she waited. Waiting was harder than building, each hour stretching out endlessly. She sat in her office with the lights dimmed, the city skyline glowing beyond her window. Her eyes fixed on the monitoring software that would alert her the moment someone accessed the honeypot. The night felt endless. Ruth had brought coffee from home, unwilling to leave her desk. The caffeine kept her alert but did nothing for her nerves, which sang with tension. She thought about the GPS tracker, about the threatening texts. Whoever was behind this had been willing to follow her, to threaten her. This was personal now, and the danger felt more real than any code on a screen. Around 3 in the morning, the screen lit up with an alert. Ruth's heart slammed against her ribs as she leaned forward, her hands gripping the desk. Someone was accessing the honeypot. The login credentials appeared on her monitor, bright and damning in the darkness. G. Ashford. Gregory Ashford, the chief technology officer who had sat in that emergency meeting with his polished smile. Betrayal now had a face, a name, a position of trusted authority that made the violation even more sickening. Ruth's breathing came shallow and fast as she watched Gregory move through the fake database, his digital footprints documenting every file he opened. The monitoring software captured everything with forensic precision: timestamps, IP addresses, the specific files he accessed. She had expected to feel triumph at this moment. Instead, she felt cold fury settling in her stomach like a stone, anger at the depth of his treachery and at how long he must have been planning this. The confrontation happened at dawn. Ruth had called Gregory to her office, her voice steady despite the adrenaline screaming through her system. He arrived wearing his usual expensive suit, his expression one of mild curiosity mixed with irritation at being summoned. The early morning light cast his face in harsh angles. He stood in her doorway with his arms crossed, a posture of defensive aggression. Ruth did not waste time on pleasantries. She turned her monitor toward him, showing the evidence she had compiled: the honeypot access logs. The file transfers, months of suspicious activity that painted an undeniable picture of systematic betrayal. "You accessed my decoy database last night," she said, her voice carrying the weight of accusation without needing to rise above conversational volume. "Everything you touched was fake, but everything you did was real." Gregory's face transformed in an instant. The mask of professional courtesy shattered, replaced by something raw and ugly. His eyes went cold, his mouth twisting into a snarl. The anger erupted from him like a dam breaking. "You think you're so clever," he hissed, his voice shaking with rage. "You built a throne here, you with your little office and your important title. But I built your stairs. 20 years I've been here, and some janitor gets my recognition because she got lucky one night?" The words hung between them, confirmation and confession wrapped together. Ruth sat perfectly still, letting him speak. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "You built a throne, I built your stairs," he repeated, as though the phrase justified everything he had done. Then Gregory fled. He spun on his heel and ran from her office, his expensive shoes pounding against the hallway floor as he headed toward the server room. Ruth bolted after him. She knew what he was doing, trying to wipe the evidence, destroy the logs. But she had anticipated this too. The critical data was already backed up in multiple locations he did not know about, encrypted and secured beyond his reach. He could erase the local footage, but he could not erase his guilt. Ruth secured enough evidence to destroy him legally before he even reached the server room. Her fingers flying across her phone as she sent the compiled proof to Langston and to the company's legal department. By the time Gregory realized his attempts at deletion were futile, his career was already over. The evidence spread across Langston's desk like fragments of a shattered mirror, each piece reflecting betrayal. Ruth had spent the morning compiling everything: months of suspicious logins, encrypted communications between Gregory Ashford and executives at Helios Systems. Wire transfers that traced corporate espionage stretching back almost 2 years. The paper trail was undeniable, documented with meticulous precision. Langston sat behind his desk with his hands pressed flat against the polished wood, his jaw tight. His chief technology officer, a man he had trusted for nearly a decade, had been systematically selling their innovations to their primary competitor. Ruth stood near the window, her arms crossed over her chest in a gesture that was half protection and half restraint. She watched Langston's face cycle through emotions: shock giving way to anger, anger hardening into something colder and more calculating. The morning light streaming through the glass made the city beyond look deceptively peaceful. As though the world outside this office remained untouched by the chaos contained within these walls. But Ruth knew better. The question hanging between them was not whether Gregory was guilty, the evidence made that brutally clear, but what they would do about it. Langston's instinct was containment. He stood abruptly, pacing to the window and back with the restless energy of someone trying to outrun an impossible decision. His hands moved as he spoke, gesturing toward imaginary scenarios, calculating risks with the same strategic mind that had built Northlake Dynamics. If we go public with this, the scandal will be catastrophic, he said, his voice tight with tension. Investors will panic. Clients will question whether their data was compromised. Our stock price will crater. Everything we've built could collapse under the weight of public perception. The fear in his words was palpable, a CEO's nightmare made real. Ruth understood the calculus he was performing, weighing the company's survival against abstract principles of honesty and accountability. She had seen this pattern before in her years of invisibility, watching powerful people make compromises that protected their positions while sacrificing everything else. Or we could handle this internally, Langston continued, his pacing growing more agitated. Fire Gregory quietly. Offer severance in exchange for silence. Tell the board we're restructuring. No one outside this building ever needs to know. Ruth let him finish, let him lay out the entire architecture of the comfortable lie. Then she spoke, her voice calm but sharp. And what happens when Helios uses the data Gregory gave them? When our innovations show up in their products? She took a step closer. You're not protecting the company by hiding this. You're protecting yourself from temporary pain. But lies don't disappear. They metastasize. Langston stopped pacing, his back to her, shoulders rigid. She could see the conflict in the set of his spine. This was the moment that would define not just the company's future but his character. Truth hurts once, she said, her voice softening but losing none of its conviction. It's sharp and immediate, but lies hurt forever. They hurt in small ways every day, in the erosion of trust. I spent years being invisible because that felt safer than being seen. I know what it costs to hide. And I'm telling you the price is too high. The silence that followed felt heavy with consequence. Langston turned slowly to face her, and she could see the war being waged behind his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. If we do this, there's no going back. The story will dominate news cycles. Ruth held his gaze, unwavering. Then we'll be vulnerable honestly. And we'll survive because people respect truth more than they respect perfection. The words hung between them like a challenge and an invitation. Langston looked down at the evidence spread across his desk, at the documented proof of betrayal. Then he looked back at Ruth, at this woman who had saved his company once already and was now asking him to save his soul. His hands came up to his face, rubbing his eyes as though trying to clear away fog. All right, he said finally, the word carrying surrender and resolve in equal measure. We tell the truth, all of it, together. Ruth felt something loosen in her chest. They would reveal everything together: the attack, the ongoing espionage, the courage it took to root out corruption from within. Whatever came next, they would face it standing in the light. The press conference room felt like stepping into an arena, the air thick with anticipation and the smell of fresh coffee. Rows of chairs faced a raised platform where a simple podium stood. Flanked by the Northlake Dynamics logo, backlit in blue that suggested both technology and trust. Cameras lined the back wall on tripods, their lenses like unblinking eyes waiting to capture whatever came next. Reporters filled the seats with notebooks open and recording devices activated, their faces showing the particular hunger of journalists who sensed a story larger than usual corporate announcements. Ruth stood backstage with Langston, her hands gripping a folder containing printed evidence. She had dressed carefully that morning, choosing a professional blazer over her usual practical attire. Aware she was about to become visible in ways that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Her reflection in the greenroom mirror had shown someone she barely recognized, not a janitor anymore. Not invisible, but a person about to step into permanent public record. Langston stood beside her in his usual sharp suit, but his tie was slightly loosened, a small concession to the stress radiating off both of them. Ready? He asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. Ruth looked at him, at this man who had chosen truth over comfort, who had decided to stand beside her rather than protecting himself through distance. She nodded once, sharp and certain, then they walked together through the curtain into the blinding wash of camera lights. The flashes started immediately, making Ruth's vision blur before adjusting. She and Langston took their positions at the podium, standing side by side. Langston gripped the edges with both hands, and when his voice emerged it carried something raw and human. He told them everything. The original cyber attack that had nearly destroyed the company. The terrifying night when systems failed. Ruth's intervention, her technical brilliance, her refusal to let them surrender. He spoke about promoting her to head of cybersecurity, about her ongoing investigation. Then he told them about Gregory Ashford, about betrayal growing for almost 2 years, about evidence of systematic espionage and collusion with Helios systems. His words fell like stones into still water, each revelation creating ripples that spread through the assembled journalists. When Langston finished, he stepped back, and Ruth moved forward to the microphone. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice was steady, clear. She explained the technical details of the honeypot, how she had traced suspicious patterns, how evidence had accumulated. She spoke about the GPS tracker, the anonymous threats, the choice between safety through invisibility and danger through exposure. Her words painted a picture of courage under pressure, of choosing integrity when the personal cost was high. The room was silent except for her voice and camera shutters. Reporters leaned forward, some with awe, others already writing headlines. The story was everything they could have hoped for: betrayal, heroism, a janitor turned cybersecurity chief who had saved a billion-dollar company twice. When Ruth finished, questions erupted. Hands shot up, voices calling out. Langston fielded questions about financial impact and legal proceedings. Ruth answered technical queries. Together they presented a united front, two people who had decided honesty was worth whatever followed. The world reacted with awe and respect. Within hours, the story trended across every major platform. Northlake Dynamics became synonymous not with scandal but with integrity. The company's reputation rebounded through the simple power of truth told without flinching. By evening, federal agents had arrested Gregory Ashford as he attempted to board a flight to Singapore. The footage showed him in handcuffs, his expensive suit rumpled, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. Helios Systems executives faced immediate investigation, their offices raided by authorities armed with warrants built on Ruth's evidence. Ruth watched the news coverage from Langston's office, seeing her own face repeated across screens with captions calling her a hero, a symbol of integrity. She had been invisible for so long that visibility felt surreal. But as Langston stood beside her watching the story unfold, she understood that this was the price and reward of being seen: accountability and recognition, vulnerability and respect, all woven together into something worth the risk. 6 months had transformed Northlake Dynamics in ways both visible and invisible. The company had survived the scandal not just intact but strengthened, quarterly earnings surpassing projections as clients rewarded their transparency. But the most profound change was not in the balance sheets, it was in the basement, where the servers hummed beneath a space that had been completely rebuilt. The grand opening of the Ruth Marlowe Innovation Center felt like stepping into a cathedral for the digital age. The basement had been transformed into a collaborative workspace flooded with natural light from new skylights. Workstations arranged in clusters suggested teamwork rather than hierarchy. Glass-walled meeting rooms lined one side, their transparency symbolizing the openness that had saved them. The centerpiece was a memorial wall made of polished steel and illuminated glass panels, displaying lines of code from the night of salvation, the commands that had brought their systems back from annihilation. Ruth stood near the entrance as employees and guests filled the space, her hand resting on the railing of the new staircase, connecting this center to the upper floors. She wore professional attire that had become familiar over the past months. But her posture still carried traces of the person who had once moved through these spaces invisibly. The transformation had happened so quickly that sometimes she still felt like she was playing a role rather than inhabiting her own life. Langston navigated through the crowd toward her, his path slowed by congratulations. When he finally reached her side, the noise created a bubble of relative privacy. He looked different than he had 6 months ago, not older exactly, but more grounded, as though the crisis had burned away something superficial. "This space is remarkable," Ruth said, her voice carrying genuine wonder. "I never imagined something like this when we were down here in the dark." Langston smiled, touched by memory and gratitude. "Neither did I," he admitted. "But you taught me something that night. The foundation matters more than the facade." The people who keep systems running matter more than the people who take credit. And truth matters more than appearance. He gestured toward the memorial wall. You didn't just restore data that night, Ruth. You restored me. You reminded me what it means to actually see people, to value substance over status. Ruth felt her throat tighten, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall. The words landed with the weight of vindication and recognition. For years she had been invisible by design, protecting herself from judgment. But Langston had seen her anyway, first out of desperation and then out of genuine recognition. You gave me more than a job, she said softly. You gave me permission to be visible. To trust that being seen could be a gift rather than a threat. The moment stretched between them, heavy with all they had survived: the attack, the betrayal. The threats, the choice to tell truth when lying would have been safer. Around them, the Innovation Center buzzed with celebration. But at its heart stood two people who understood that the real miracle was not about technology or security systems. Their partnership, built on trust and humility, had become legend within the company. Young employees spoke of them in tones usually reserved for founding myths. Telling the story of the night when everything almost ended and how two unlikely allies had saved not just the company but its soul. Langston raised his hand for the crowd's attention. Conversations died as everyone turned toward where he and Ruth stood. He spoke without notes, telling the story one more time. He thanked Ruth publicly, spoke about the values this space represented, about innovation built on integrity. But it was the final line, delivered as his eyes held Ruth's, that would echo for years to come. The miracle wasn't the recovery, Langston said, his voice thick with emotion. It was remembering to see each other. The applause was genuine and sustained, but Ruth barely heard it. She was looking at the memorial wall, at the lines of code. That represented the moment when two people had chosen to trust each other across an impossible divide. The basement where she had once been invisible now bore her name. But more importantly, it reminded everyone that the people who remain those who stay, who fight, who refuse to let systems or relationships die are the ones who create miracles through the simple revolutionary act of truly seeing one another. In a world that often overlooks the quiet ones, courage can come from the most unexpected places. Ruth and Langston's story reminds us that honesty doesn't destroy, it rebuilds. When we choose truth over fear, we don't just save a company. We save each other. If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes that integrity and kindness matter. Write your thoughts below, your words mean more than you think. Stay with us for more true stories of strength, redemption, and second chances. Thank you for watching. This has been Golden Heart Stories.